Kings from thy heirs and conquerors shall spring, who will the world into subjection bring. And in the times of Christianity, it brought forth the noble Emperor Constantine, who gave the city of Rome and all the imperial arms to guard, and to St. Peter and Sylvester the Pope, whose stirrup he refused not to hold, and pleased rather to be called defender of the Holy Roman Church than emperor any more, and lest the peace of our Lord the Pope should suffer any disturbance by the noise of secular affairs, he left the city and bestowed it on the Pope, and founded the city of Constantinople for his own habitation. London also in these latter times hath brought forth famous and magnificent princes, Maud the Empress, King Henry III, and Thomas the Archbishop, a glorious martyr of Christ, than whom no man was more innocent or more devoted to the general good of the Latin world. In connection with this important document, certain notes are necessary. There were, Fitzstephen says, 13 larger conventual churches and 126 lesser parish churches. The 13 conventual churches were, one supposes St. Paul's, to which was attached a college of priests, St. Martin's le Grand, the Priory of the Holy Trinity, St. Mary Overwise, the Hospital of St. Catherine by the Tower, the Priory of St. Bartholomew, the Priory of St. John, the Nunnery of Clerkenwell, the Hospital of St. James, St. Mary Spittal, the Hospital of St. Thomas of Aachen, the Hospital of St. Giles, and the Abbey of Bermondsey. It is possible, however, that his list did not include houses so far from London as St. Giles, St. James, and 319 Bermondsey. It certainly did not include Westminster Abbey. The number of parish churches indicates that the city was now completely divided into parishes. Little change, if any, was made in the city parishes from the time of the Confessor till the Great Fire. After this, many of the old parish churches were not rebuilt, and at the present day, we continually witness a ruthless destruction of old churches and old associations. We have already tried to get some idea of the number of the inhabitants from other sources. We may try again by considering the number of the churches. Every man in the city belonged, of course, to his parish church. Every man was compelled to obey the church, to fast on fast days, and to attend Mass regularly on Sundays and holy days. If we allow 800 souls only, men, women, and children, for each church we have a total of 108,200. And this, subject to oscillations caused by losses from plague or from war, sometimes as much as 100,000, and sometimes dropping to 50,000, I take to have been the average population of London for many centuries. The White Tower. Fitzstephen's Palatine Tower is the White Tower, and the other two towers are Baynard's Castle and Montfichet, both built near the junction of the Fleet with the Thames. Fitzstephen speaks with pardonable exaggeration of the northern fields, which were still undrained and covered with bog and quagmire. The tillage fields were those belonging to the monks of Westminster south of Holborn and Oxford Street. The 7 gates were those of Aldgate, Bishopsgate, Cripplegate, Aldersgate, Newgate, Ludgate and Bridgegate. Note that the riverside wall by this time had disappeared. It had either fallen down or been taken down. The foundations have been partially uncovered in modern times. The river wall became practically useless after the erection of the tower and the spread of warehouses along the bank. The bridge could be used to prevent the passage of ships under the arches, so that the upper part of the river was safe, while the tower might be trusted to defend the small part of the town below the bridge, which besides could only be approached by the narrow stairs or the quays. The artisans of the several crafts, the vendors of the various commodities and the labourers of every kind, have each their separate stations which they take every morning. This shows that the people exposed their wares and carried on their industries in certain assigned spots. Here they had their cells, which were large sheds protected from the weather, in which the things were exposed for sale. A modern fruit market is a celd. Formerly there were celds for everything, and the celd might be a single shanty or it might be a great market like Leadenhall. The names of the modern streets preserve the memory of these celds: Honey Lane, Milk Street, Soapers, Lane, Wood Street, the Poultry, Friday Street, where food proper for Friday was sold, and so forth. Fitzstephen affords a pleasant glimpse of a busy and prosperous city. Would that the writer had gone into a little more detail. As it is, we are thankful for what we get. We could not spare one word of what is written. And he tells us so much in a few words. What, for instance, can be more complete and more suggestive to the imagination than his description of the London matrons in one word, pithy and full of meaning? They are Sabines, Sabini sunt. Quod si pudica mulia in partum juvens, damum atque dulces liberos, Sabina qualis. Chapter 8. The streets and the people. The city at this time occupied the same area as the Roman Augusta. The conditions of marsh and moor on all sides remained very little changed from the prehistoric days, when London had not yet come into existence save for beaten paths or roads leading to northwest and east, and a causeway leading south. Right through the middle of the town flowed the Walbrook, which rose in the moor and ran into the river by means of a culvert. In the Norman time, the Walbrook was one of the chief supplies of water that the town possessed. London relied for her water on the Fleet River on the west, on the Walbrook in the midst, on wells scattered here and there about the city, and upon certain springs of which we know little. At this day, for instance, there is a spring of water under the southwest corner of the Bank of England, which still flows, as it always has done, along the channel of the ancient Walbrook. But as yet there were no conduits of water brought into the town. Within the town there were 126 parish churches, all of which belonged to Saxon London, a fact which is proved by the patron saints to whom they are dedicated. The Norman conquest added nothing to the list of churches. Before the conquest, the only religious house within the walls was that of St. Martin's le Grand, which was a college of canons, CP 212. A legend describes the foundation of a small nunnery at the south end of the ferry over the river. There was also the cathedral establishment. As yet there were no mendicant friars preaching in the street and begging in the houses, nor did any monastery rear its stately church, or receive the offerings of the faithful. The parish church had no foundations or endowments of chantry, obit or day of memory. The cathedral establishment was small and modest compared with that of the 13th century. The bishop lived in his palace close to St. Paul's. The cathedral would be called a stately church even now. It was low with thick pillars and round arched windows which were already filled with painted glass. The parish churches were quite small, and for the most part of wood. The name of All Hallows Staining or All Hallows Stone shows that it was an exceptional thing for a church to be built of stone. Representation of Orion. Tib Ms. BV 11th cent. There were 2 fortresses in the city, as we have seen, both belonging to the 322 king. The modern idea of a street with its opposite row of houses all in line must be altogether laid aside when we go back to the 11th century. It is, in fact, quite impossible to lay down a street as it actually existed at that time. The most important street in the city, Thames Street, did certainly possess a tolerably even line on its south side. The old course of the river wall and the quays compelled a certain amount of alignment, but on the north side the street was sometimes narrow, sometimes broad, because there was no such reason for an even line. Sometimes a great house pushed out a gabled front into the street. Sometimes a garden interposed or a warehouse stood back, leaving a broad space in front. As for regularity of alignment, no one thought of such a thing. Even down to the reign of Queen Elizabeth only the main streets, such as Cheapside, possessed any such regularity. In one of the exhibitions a few years since, there was a show which 323 they called a street of Old London. The houses were represented as being all in line, as they would be today, or as they were in Cheapside in the time of Elizabeth. Considered as a street of Plantagenet London, the thing was absurd, but no one took the trouble to say so, and it pleased many. Craftsmen at work on a house. From Claude Ms. B. Roman 4, 11th cent. On the north part of the city, the manors, which were the original wards of the city, were still in the 11th century held by families who had been possessed of them for many generations. Even since the resettlement of the city by Alfred, the names of some of the old city families survive. For instance, Bucarel, Auger, Aylwin, Ansgar, Luard, Farringdon, Haverhill, Basing, Horn, Algar and others. On the south part along the river, it is probable that they had long since been sold and cut up, just as would happen in modern times for building purposes. The northern quarter, however, was not so thickly built upon, and the manors still preserved something of a rural appearance with broad gardens and orchards. Therefore, in this quarter, the industries of the city found room to establish themselves. It must be remembered that a medieval city made everything that was wanted for the daily life. In modern times we have separated the industries. For instance, the 1,001 things that are wanted in iron are made in Birmingham, our knives and cutlery are made in Sheffield. But in the 11th century London made its own ironwork, its own steelwork, its own goldsmiths and silversmiths, work, its saddlery, its leatherwork, its furniture, everything. The craftsmen gathered together according to their trades. First, because the craft was hereditary by unwritten law and custom, so that the men of the same trade married in their trade and formed a tribe apart. They were all one family. Next, because there was but one market or place of sale for each trade, the saddlers having their own sheds or shops, the goldsmiths theirs, and so on. A separate 324 craftsman, if it had been possible for such a man to exist, would have found it impossible to sell his wares, except at the appointed place. Of shops there were none except in the markets. Next, the workmen had to live together because they had in their own place their workshops and the use of common tools and appliances. And lastly, because a trade working for little more than the needs of the city must be careful not to produce too much, not to receive too many apprentices, and to watch over the standard of work. Every craft, therefore, lived together, under laws and regulations of its own, with a warden and a governing body. The men understood, long before the modern creation of trades unions, what was meant by a trades union. They formed these unions, not only because they were created in the interests of all, but because they were absolutely necessary for mere existence. They lived, I say, together and close to each other, each craft with its own group of houses or cottages, perhaps mere huts of wattle and daub with thatched roofs, and a hole in the roof for the smoke to go out. And they lived in the north part of London, because it was thinly populated and removed from those to whom the noise of their work might give offence. One proof of the comparative thinness of population in the north quarter is furnished by the fact that south of Cheapside there were more than twice as many churches as in the north. Now, when these people began to cluster together, which was long before the Norman conquest, in fact soon after Alfred's settlement, they built their cottages each to please himself. Thus it was that one house faced the east, another the south, another the northwest. The winding ways were not required for carts or vehicles, which could not be used in these narrow lanes, only for a means of communication by which the things the craftsmen made might be carried to Cheapside or Eastcheap, or wherever their productions were exposed for sale. On the north side of Cheapside, therefore, London presented the appearance of a cluster of villages with their parish churches. Each village contained the craftsmen of some trade or mystery. Perhaps the same parish church served for 2 or more such villages. This part of London was extremely picturesque, according to our ideas. The parish churches were small, and, as I have already said, mostly built of wood. Around them were the houses and workshops of the craftsmen. The green churchyard lay about the church. On the north between the houses and the wall were orchards and gardens. The lane from the village to West or East Cheap lay between the houses, winding and turning, sometimes narrow, sometimes broad. The prentices carried the wares as they were made to the market, where they were exposed for sale all day. From every one of these villages, from 6 in the morning till 8 in the evening, the sounds of labour were heard. The clang of the hammer on the anvil, the roar of the furnace, the grating of the saw, and the multitudinous tapping, beating, and banging of work and industry. It was a busy and industrious place, where everything was made in the city that was wanted by the city. We shall have to consider the guilds or guilds in connection with the rise of the companies separately. It must be remembered, however, that guilds were already in existence, and that there were many of them. See Medieval London Vol. Roman II, p. 108. We have been speaking of the northern quarter of London. Let us turn next to that part which lay south of Cheapside. The removal of the river wall followed, but gradually, the reclaiming of the foreshore along the north bank. London Wall. We have seen how the first ports of London, Walbrook and Billingsgate, were constructed. The former, a natural harbour but very small, was protected by towers or bastions on either side, and was provided with quays, resting on piles driven into the mud. The latter was simply cut out of the mud and shingle, kept in shape by piles driven close together, and provided with quays laid upon the piles. As trade increased, the quays increased, not only laterally, but by being advanced farther out into the foreshore. Consider that the process was going on continually, that not only did the quays extend, but that warehouses and houses of all kinds were built upon the sloping bank. The section shows what was going on. The quay Q resting on piles driven into the bed of the river Arb in front of the sloping bank BC, the warehouse erected behind it resting against the wall, the level space CD cleared for the wall W where is now Thames Street, the low hill behind D. The wall was in the way, without authority, without order. The people pierced it with posterns leading to quays and stairs. Without authority they gradually pulled it down. It is impossible to say when this demolition began. The river wall was standing in the time of Cnut. It appears no more. When Queen Hythe, Edred's Hythe, was constructed, in size and shape like the port of Billingsgate, either a postern had to be made for it, or a postern already existed. The reclaiming of the foreshore, CP 125, was a very important addition to the area of London. It added a slip of ground 2,200 yards in length by an average of 100 yards in breadth, i.e. about 45 acres of ground, which was presently covered with narrow lanes between warehouses. The lanes, many of which remain and are curious places to visit, led to river stairs, and were the residences of the people employed in the service of the port. As for the removal of the wall, exactly the same process was followed in the 17th and 18th centuries, when the people began gradually to take down the city wall. They built against it, before it and behind it, and no one interfered. The lower part of the town was by far the more crowded. If we take a map of London and count the churches immediately north and south of Cheapside and Cornhill, this fact comes home to us very clearly. Thus, there are north of that boundary 31, south of the boundary there are 68, counting roughly. The lower part of the town contained the wharves and the warehouses, the lodgings of the people employed in the work of loading and unloading the ships, the taverns and the places of refreshment for the sailors and such persons. The narrow lanes and the absence of any historical houses in the part south of Thames Street show that the place, after the reclaiming of the foreshore, was always what it is now, either a place for warehouses or for the residents of the service. A great many of the merchants lived on the rising ground north of Thames Street, hence we find here a great many companies, halls. Here Whittington, later on, had his lordly house in which he interviewed kings. Here, in the time we are considering, such Norman nobles and knights as had houses in the city all lived. Thus in Elbow Lane lived Pont de l'Arche, second founder of St. Mary Overwise. The Earls of Arundel had a house in Bartolf Lane, Billingsgate. Lord Beaumont, but this was later, lived beside Paul's Wharf. Henry Fitz Aylwin, first Mayor of London, lived close beside London Stone. I do not suppose that any of the houses in Norman London could compare with the palaces erected by the merchants of the 14th century. There was no such place as Crosby Hall among them, but still they were good and stately houses. There was a large hall in which the whole family lived. The fire was made in a fireplace with open bars. The smoke ascended to the roof, where it found a way out by the lantern. The windows were perhaps glazed. Certainly glass merchants appeared in the country in the 11th century. If they were not glazed, they were covered with a white cloth which admitted light. The 2 meals of the day were served on tables consisting of boards laid on trestles. The servants all slept on the floor on the rushes, each with a log of wood for a pillow, and wrapped in his blanket. The master of the house had 1 or more bedrooms over the kitchen called the solar, where he slept in beds, he and his wife and family. At the other end of the hall was a room called the ladies' bower, where the ladies of the house sat in the daytime with the maids. If you want to see an admirable specimen of the medieval house with the hall, the solar, and the bower all complete, you may see it at Stokesay Castle, near Ludlow. In the craftsmen's cottages the people seem to have all slept on straw. In the 14th century, however, we find the craftsmen amply provided with blankets, pillows, and feather beds. We can, in fact, at this period divide the city into parallel belts, according to the character and calling of the residents. Everything to do with the export, import, and wholesale trade was conducted in Thames Street, and on its wharves, 327 the porters, stevedores, servants, and sailors lived in the narrow lanes about Puddle Dock at one end of Thames Street, and Tower Hill at the other. That is the first belt, the belt of the port. The rising ground on the north was the residence of the merchants and the better sort. That is the second belt. Next comes the breadth of land bounded by Watling Street and Eastcheap on the south, and by an imaginary line a little north of Cheapside on the north. This was mainly given over to retail trade, and it is the third belt. My theory is illustrated by the names. Thus I find in this retail belt all the names of streets indicating markets, not factories. A Norman halls. The fourth belt is that quarter where the industries were carried on, namely, the large part of the city lying north of Cheapside and Cornhill. Let me repeat that London was a hive of industries. I have counted belonging to the 14th century as many as 284 crafts mentioned in the books, and of course there must have been many others not mentioned. I have called attention to the fact that in the 11th century there was but one religious house in the city of London. Considering the great number which sprang up in the next 100 years, this seems remarkable. Let us, however, remind ourselves of an important feature in the history of religion and of religious houses in this country. I mean the successive waves of religious enthusiasm which from time to time have passed over our people. In the 8th century there fell upon Saxon England one of these waves, a most curious and unexampled wave, of religious excitement. There appeared over the whole country just the 328 same spirit of emotional religion which happens at an American camp meeting or a Salvation Army assembly. Men and women, including kings and queens, earls and princesses, noble thanes and ladies, were alike seized with the idea that the only way to escape from the wrath to come was by way of the monastic life. They therefore crowded into the religious houses and filled them all. After the long struggle with the Danes, for 200 years there was no more enthusiasm for the religious life, for all the men were wanted for the army, and all the women were wanted to become mothers of more fighting men. The coldness with which the religious life was viewed by the Londoners was therefore caused by the absolute necessity of fighting for their existence. One religious house, and that not a monastery but a college, was enough for them. They wanted no more. But London was never irreligious. There was as yet no hatred of church or priest. There was as yet no suspicion or distrust as to the doctrines taught by Mother Church. For 300 years the citizens felt no call to the monastic life. In the reign of Henry I, a second wave of religion, of which I have already spoken twice, fell upon the people, and especially the people of London. It was the same wave that drove the French to the Crusades. Under the influence of this new enthusiasm, founders of religious houses sprang up in all directions. Already in 1086, Aylwin, a merchant of London, had founded St. Saviour's Abbey, in Bermondsey. In Bermondsey Abbey it was intended to create a foundation exactly resembling that of St. Peter's, Westminster. Like the latter house, Bermondsey Abbey was established upon a low-lying islet among the reeds of a broad marsh near the river. The house was destined to have a long and an interesting history, but to be in no way the rival or the sister of Westminster. Another religious house was that of St. Bartholomew's Hospital and Priory, founded by Raher, variously stated to have been a jester, a minstrel, a man of mean extraction, and a man of knightly parentage. His origin matters nothing, yet his foundation exists still, and still confers every year the benefits of an hospital upon thousands of those who suffer and are sick. See Medieval London Vol. Roman II, p. 250. Every one knows the Church of St. Mary Overwise, commonly called the Church of St. Saviour, across the river. That church belonged to the religious house founded or rebuilt and magnified by 2 Norman knights. We have spoken of St. Giles in the Fields already. There was a nunnery founded at Clerkenwell about the year 1100. There was also a house of St. John, see Medieval London, Vol. Roman II, p. 270. The last of the houses due to this religious revival is the Priory of the Holy Trinity, Aldgate. This was founded by one Norman as a house of Augustinian canons. The Queen, Henry I's Saxon Queen Matilda, endowed it with land and with the revenues of Aldgate. It must be acknowledged that this religious revival was both of long continuance and of real depth, since so many were seized 329 by it, and moved either to found houses of religion, or to take upon them the vows of religion. 3 bishops. Nero Ms. c. Roman IV, 12th cent. There is one more illustration of this religious revival of the 12th century. This is the Cenith Guild or Guild. One writer would see in this guild the lost merchant guild of the city, of which I have already spoken, see Medieval London Vol. Roman II, p. 113, and in the action of the leaders, the destruction of the merchant guild. Others would see in it a guild for the defense of the city. I confess that I cannot understand why the merchant guild of the whole city should be destroyed by the action of 15 leaders, nor how a commercial association for the good of all could be broken up by a few of its more important members. It would be also very difficult to make out that this Cenith Guild did in any sense correspond to the merchant guild, and I would ask what a merchant guild had to do with fighting. Yet Stowe undoubtedly preserves a tradition of battle about the Cenith Guild. The theory that there was a company or guild whose duty it was to organize the defense of the city, to be the officers of a militia containing every able-bodied man within the walls, seems to account for 330 everything. Now this body of citizen soldiers had already 6 times beaten off the Danes. They therefore possessed an honourable record. When William took possession he was careful to disturb nothing, therefore he did not disturb the Cenith Guild. If the object of their existence, however, was the defence of the city, they had nothing more to do. For when William built the White Tower in the east and Montfichet in the west, he said to the citizen soldiers practically, "I will take care of your defence, your work is done." This may be theory and imagination. To me it seems to account for the Cenith Guild more naturally than the supposition of a merchant guild, for one does understand the coming of a time when it was no longer necessary to have such a guild of defence. But one does not understand how any time, or any combination of circumstances, would make it necessary, or even permissible, for the leaders to surrender or to destroy the merchant guild, which regulated the whole trade of the city, and was above and before all other guilds. The facts of the case are as follows. Their meaning and importance have been misunderstood until they were explained by Mr. J. H. Round. In the year 1881, however, a paper on the subject was read before the London and Middlesex Archaeological Society by Mr. H. C. Coote. They are, briefly, as follows. The land which now forms the ward of Portsoken, i.e. the Soch or Socken of the city, was in the hands of a certain body known as the Cenith Guild. There were 15 of them whose names have been preserved. They were Rolf, son of Algode, Walwood le Dovrish, Augur le Prude, Edward up Cornhill, Blackstone and Alwyn his cousin, Aylwyn and Robert his brother, sons of Leofston, another Leofston the goldsmith and Wiser his son, Hugh son of Wulgar, Augur son of Derriman, Algar Fecusen, Osbert Drinchuin and Adelard Hornwhitesum. These men, all London citizens of position, held the lands on trust as members of the guild. It was called the Senehin Guild, the Soldiers' Guild. They possessed, among other things, a charter of King Edward the Confessor. It ran as follows: Edward the King greeteth Elefward the Bishop, and Wulfgar the Portreeve, and all the burgesses of London as a friend, and I make known to you that I will that my men in the English Guild of Knights retain their manorial rights within the city and without over their men. And I will that they retain the good laws, i.e. the privileges, which they had in King Eadgar's day and in my father's and Senat's day. And I will also, 27 with guard and also man, and I will not permit that any man wrong them, but they shall all be in peace and God preserve you all. There had been charters, therefore, of Edgar, Ethelred and Senat. The charter of Edward presupposes the existence of the guild in the time of Edgar. Now, under the Saxon customs, a guild was legally constituted when the members 331 created it. The consent of the king was an invention of Norman times. Yet it seems probable that the guild was first founded in the reign of Edgar for reasons advanced by Coote. Immediately before that king's accession to the throne, there had arisen a very cogent necessity for the city to look out for increased protection, for some regular and settled means, which should ensure her citizens against sudden and stealthy attacks during that chronic warfare to which the age had been for some time tending. There had been a civil war caused by the disgust of a part of the nation at King Eadwig's unparalleled profligacy, and in that war, as it is expressly stated by historians, the outskirts of London had suffered much. During its pendency, there had been fighting and devastation on both sides of the Thames in the immediate vicinity of the city. The Senehin Guild, therefore, appears to have been an association founded for the purpose of providing for every occasion a permanent standing garrison of defence. The ruling body contained a certain number of leading London citizens. They were the officers of the guild. They administered the funds and property belonging to the guild, and were useful in repairing the wall and gates, and in providing arms. It was only by means of the guild, in which the members were under oath of obedience, that such a garrison could be got together and maintained. How many members the guild at first contained is not known. It is, however, probable that by the year 1125, when the 15 named above are described as of the ancient stock of noble English soldiers, the guild had become a small survival still owning property, though, as we have seen, they could have had no duties to perform. William, however, recognized the existence of the guild and granted them a charter. This is lost, but the charter of William Rufus, which remains, refers to it. William, King of England, to Bishop M. and G. de Magneville and R. Delpere, and his lieges of London, greeting. Know ye that I have granted to the men of the Senehin Guild their guild, and the land which belonged to them, with all customs, as they were in the time of King Edward and my father. Witness Henry de Both, at Rething. And Henry I also granted them a charter, in which he refers to those of his father and his brother. Henry, King of England, to Bishop M. to the Gerepher of London, and to all his barons and lieges of London, French and English, greeting. Know ye that I have granted to all the men of the Senehin Guild their guild and land which belonged to them, with all customs, as were better in the time of King Edward and my father, and as my brother granted to them by writ and his seal, and I forbid upon pain of forfeiture to me that any man dare do them an injury in respect of this. Witness R. de Mountford and R. Bigot and H. de Booth at Westminster. London and Middlesex, 1881, Vol. VP 488. 60 years after the conquest, the Guild, realizing that the original reason for their association no longer remained in existence, proposed to dissolve. What were they to do with the property for which they were trustees? It was the property of the city. It had to be used for the benefit of the city. What better, according to the light of the time, could they do with it than hand it over to the church and to ask for the prayers of holy men? Accordingly, they asked permission of the king to convey the property to the priory of the Holy Trinity. His consent was obtained. The king appointed as commissioners for the conveyance Aubrey de Vere, who was afterwards killed in a street riot, and Gervase of Cornhill, and the document was signed by the members of the guild, whose names have been already set forth. The following document is quoted by Mr. Coote from the records of the Hustings Court at Guildhall. Anno ab incarnation Domini millesimo centesimo octo, et anno rigni gloriosi regis, Henris I octo, fundata est Ecclesia Sanct Trinitatis, infraalgate London per venerabulum reginam matildum uxorum regis predicti. Et concilio sancti archipreciulis Anselmi data est dicta Ecclesia Normano priori primo totius regni canonico. A quo tota Anglia sancti Augustini regula ornator, et habitu canonicali vestita, et congregatis ibidem fratribus ogebator, indicta ecclesia multitudo laudantium diem die ac, noct ita quad tota siuitas delectabator in aspectu aerum, in tantum quad anno ab incarnation domini millesimo, centesimo vicimo quinto quidem burgensis Londoni ex illa antiqua nobilium militum anglorum progeni, silicet Radulfus filius Algodi Walwoodus Ledovrish, Augurus Leprude, Edwardus up Cornhill, Blackstonus et Alwinus cognitus Ius, Aelwinus et Robertus frater Ius filii Leistoni, Leistonus Orifaber, et Wiso filius Ius, Hugo filius Vulgari Algurus, Fecusen sic, Augurus filius Derimani, Ospertus Drinchuin, Adelardus Hornweitzum, sic, Canunians in capitulo Ecclesi Christi, quesita est inframuros Iustum ciutatis, iuxta portum que nuncupator algata dederunt ipsi Ecclesi, et canonicis Dio seruintibus, in totem terram et sacum, que dispater de Anglish sinithigilda urbis, que muro adiacit foras, indem portam et protunditer usque in fluium temsium, dederunt inquam suscipiens fraternitatem, et participium beneficiarum, loci Elias per manum Normani prioris, qui ius et predecessors, suus in societatem super textum evangelae recepit. Et ut firma et incanutta, sic for inconcussa, starit hec aerum donatio cardum sancti Edwardi, cum aliis cardis prescriptis quas in de habebunt super alter optularunt, et deigned super ipsum terram sacierunt predictum priorum per ecclesiam sancti Batulfi, quae edificata est super im et est ut aiunt caput ipsius ter. Hec omnia facta sunt coram his testibus Bernardo prior de Dunstapel, etc. etc. miserunt ergo predicti donators quendam ex sapsis, ordgarum silicet Leprude, ad regem Henricum petens ut ips donationum aerum concederit et confirmerit, rex viro libenter concessit predictam sacum et terram prefate ecclesi liberam, et quaedam ab omni servicio sicut elemosinam, deset et cartam suam sequentum confirmerit. London and Middlesex, 1881, Vol. VPP. 477-478. The soc thus transferred was the right to administer justice, civil or criminal, to, and in respect of, the men or under tenants of the guild. The right therefore belonged henceforth to the prior of the convent who, when Portsoken became a ward, was ex officio alderman of that ward. It is very remarkable that writers on this conveyance have always, down to Mr. Round, assumed that the 15 who constituted the guild entered the priory, and assumed the vows of the order. The Latin words are, however, quite clear. I repeat them. Dederunt inquam suscipiens fraternitatem et participium beneficiarum loci Elias per manum Normani prioris, qui ius et predecessors suus in societatem super textum evangelae recepit. That is, taking up the fraternity and share in the benefits of that place, by the hand of Norman the prior, who received them and their predecessors into the society on the text of the Gospels. There was attached to every monastery a fraternity whose numbers were not limited, their duties were not defined, probably there were no duties except attendance once a year or so, and gifts to the house according to the power and means of the giver. At the hour of death the members put on the robe of the order. The guild, therefore, entered the fraternity and obtained, by their gift of this land, all the benefits that the fraternity would claim from its connection with the house for themselves and their predecessors. Their predecessors could not enter the house, nor could they, since they were on exactly the same footing as their predecessors. Round illustrates the point by a note. Good instances in point are found in the Ramsey cartulary, where in 1081 a benefactor to the abbey, suscepit e contra domino abate et ab omnibus fratribus plenum fraternitatem pro rege Wilhelmo, et pro regina Matilda, et pro comite Roberto, et pro semitipso et uxor sua, et filio quia Jews erit hears, et pro pater et mater ejus, ut sunt participes orationum elemosinarum, et omnium beneficiarum ipsorum, sed et omnium fratrum sive monasteriorum equibus societatem susceperunt in omnibus sicut ex ipsis. Better still is this parallel. Reinaldus Arbus, et totus fratrum conventus de rame circunctis fratribus qui sunt apud ferifeld in gilda, salutum in Christo, volumus ut siedes quad vobis nostram fraternitatem concessimus et communionum beneficii, quam pro nobismit ipsis quotidi agimus, per serlonum, qui vester fuit legatus ad nos, ut citis participes in hoc et in futuro seculo. The date of this transaction was about the same as that of the admission of the Senihin Guild to a share in the benefits of Holy Trinity, and the grant was similarly made in return for an endowment, the Commune of London. But he proves the point still more clearly when he traces the subsequent history of the 15 for many years after the conveyance in act and deed outside the priory. The marriage of priests was a burning subject of the day. Practically, priests in England were as much married then as the Anglican clergy are now. They married, as will be shown presently, into families of good position, and occupied much the same position as they do at present, but it was resolved at Rome that celibacy should be enforced among the clergy. The evidence of the chronicles is somewhat conflicting. There were two important synods on ecclesiastical affairs, the first held in 1102, and the second in 1108. The celibacy of the clergy appears to the historian a smaller matter than the investiture of any ecclesiastical dignity by the hand of a layman. Florence of Worcester, circa 1118, mentions the Synod of 1102 and says nothing about the question of celibacy, but refers the decrees on the subject to the year 1108. He also gives in full 17 canons passed at the Synod of 1125, held at Westminster, by John de Cremona. He says nothing about the cardinal's confusion and shame. He also quotes the decrees of the Synod of 1127. Henry of Huntingdon, circa 1154, says, "At the feast of St. Michael the same year, 1102, Anselm, the archbishop, held a synod at London, in which he prohibited the English priests from living with concubines, a thing not before forbidden. Some thought it would greatly promote purity, while others saw the danger in a strictness which, requiring a continence above their strength, might lead them to fall into horrible uncleanness, to the great disgrace of their Christian profession. In this synod several abbots who had acquired their preferment by means contrary to the will of God, lost them by a sentence conformable to his will." And under the year 1125, he describes the visit of John de Cremona, with the discovery which brought his mission to a hurried conclusion. At Easter, John of Cremona, Cardinal of Rome, came into England and visited all the bishoprics and abbeys, not without having many gifts made him. This cardinal, who in the council bitterly inveighed against the concubines of priests, saying that it was a great scandal that they should rise from the side of a harlot to make Christ's body, was the same night surprised in company with a prostitute. Though he had that very day consecrated the host, the fact was so notorious that it could not be denied, and it is not proper that it should be concealed. The high honour with which the cardinal had been everywhere received was now converted to disgrace, and by the judgment of God, he turned his steps homewards in confusion and dishonour. Roger of Wendover, d. 1256, says that in 1102 Anselm excommunicated priests who had concubines. He says that the council of 1108 was occupied with the question of investiture. As to the affair of 1125, he simply copies Henry of Huntingdon. Matthew of Westminster, circa 1320, says that in 1102 Anselm, at a synod held in St. Paul's, excommunicated priests who kept concubines, or in plain words were married. The synod of 1108, he says, was occupied by the question of investiture. About the cardinal John of Cremona he merely says, "The said John, who in the council had most especially condemned all priests who kept concubines, being detected himself in the same vice, excused the vice because he said that he was not himself a priest, but a reprover of priests." The three strenuous efforts made in 1102, 1108, and in 1125 show the importance attached to the question of priests' marriages by the Church of Rome. The deans of 1102, the canons of 1125, and the statutes of 1127 are a revelation of the abuses which were then prevalent in the Church. It would be interesting to compare these ordinances with the condition of the Church in the following centuries. The canons, see Appendix, declared the whole of the Church offices except marriage, viz., chrism, oil, baptism, penance, visitation of the sick, Holy Communion and burial, open to all without fee. They forbade the inheritance of church patronage. They ordered clerks holding benefices to be ordained priests without delay, that the office of dean or prior should be held by a priest, and that of archdeacon by a deacon at least, that the bishop alone should have the power of ejecting any person from a benefice, that an excommunicated person should not receive communion from any, that pluralists should be made illegal, that priests should have no women in their houses except such as were free from suspicion, that marriage should be prohibited, that sorcerers should be excommunicated, that priests who kept their concubines should be deprived of their benefice, that the concubines should be expelled the parish, that priests should not hold farms, that tithes be paid honestly, that no abbess or nun was to wear garments more costly than lamb's wool or cat's skin. These regulations were stringent in the highest degree. Nevertheless, they appear to have been totally disregarded. 100 years later, when the interdict was laid upon England, we find that the priests' concubines throughout the country had to pay ransom. For the priests did not give up their wives. They continued to marry. They also continued to present their sons to benefices. In a word, the law became, like most of the medieval laws, ineffectual because there was no means of enforcing it, and the opinion of the people was against it. On the one hand, there was the danger of the priesthood becoming an hereditary caste, and of benefices descending as by right 336 from father to son, a danger which the subsequent history of the Anglican Church shows to have been imaginary or exaggerated. On the other hand, there were the great dangers resulting from the enforced suppression of the most powerful passion, the most overwhelming of all passions, in some men simply irresistible, by denying the natural custom of wedlock. And as history abundantly proves, these dangers were not imaginary. As to the quarrel between Henry and Anselm, that belongs to the history of the country rather than to that of London. Chapter 9. Social life. Let us pass on to consider the daily life of the people. To begin with, they were a busy people. There were no idle men. Everybody followed some pursuit. There were the wholesale merchants, the retailers, and the craftsmen. I have submitted a rough division of London streets into belts. In thinking of the aspect of the city, understand that there were no shops in the streets at all, nor was there any crying of things up and down the streets. All the retail trade was carried on in the markets, West Cheap and East Cheap, and the wholesale trade was conducted in Thames Street beside the quays and the warehouses. The markets were first Billingsgate for fish, salt, onions, other fruits and roots, wheat and all kinds of grain. Every great ship paid for standage 2d, every small ship 1 penny, a lesser ship 1 penny, a lesser boat a halfpenny for every 2 quarters of corn the king was to have 1 farthing, on a comb of corn 1 penny, on every ton of ale going out of England 4d, on every 1,000 herrings, a farthing, etc. Queenhithe or Edred's Hithe was probably of later date than Billingsgate. London had already among her inhabitants many merchants of foreign descent. They came from Caen and from Rouen, from Germany and from Flanders. The emperor's men had already set up their steelyard and begun to trade within walls of their own, protected by strong gates, and possessed of extensive privileges. The men of Lubeck, Hamburg, and the Flemings, who did not belong to the Guildhalla Teutonicorum, also set up their fortified trading houses. I do not suppose that the connection which was afterwards established between London and the country gentry had yet been established. Indeed, it is impossible, seeing that most of the manors of England had been granted to the Norman followers of King William, and as yet these new masters of the soil were in no sense English. But, as we have seen, many of the nobles already had their town houses in London. In the Dialoga Scaccario, printed in full in Maddox's History of the Exchequer, and in Stubbs's Select Charters, there is a most valuable passage on the fusion of the Normans and the English. It is as follows. In the early condition of the kingdom after the conquest, those who were left of the subject English used to lay snares secretly against the race of Normans suspected and hateful to them. Here and there, wherever the chance offered, they murdered Normans in their forests and remote places, in punishment for which, when the kings and their ministers for several years raged against the English with exquisite modes of torture, yet found that they would not wholly desist, it was at length resolved that the 100 in which a Norman was found murdered, if the murderer was not discovered or took to flight, should be condemned to pay a large sum of money, sometimes as much as 36 or even 43 pounds, according to the character of the place and the frequency of the crime. Now, however, the English and the Normans living together and intermarrying with each other, the two nations are so mixed that it is difficult to distinguish, among free men, who is English and who is Norman by descent. Building a house. Claude Misby, Roman IV, 11th century. The fusion of the races was more easy in London than in the country, partly because the Normans had already been settled in the place, and were carrying on the very considerable trade which existed with Rouen, Caen, and other northern ports, partly because there was no rankling sense of injury, such as that which filled the hearts of dispossessed Saxon thanes. The Norman king kept his word with London. He oppressed no citizen, he deprived no citizen of his property. Moreover, the Normans appear to have taken the lead in many things. Their superior refinement has been somewhat exaggerated, especially when we read of the accomplishments and the learning of the Anglo-Saxon ladies. But there can be no doubt that they introduced habits of temperance in the matter of strong drink. The Norman merchant was held in honour by the Norman knight, and the Norman noble had his town house in the city. Young Thomas Becket was a friend of Richard de l'Aigle of Pevensey. Ecclesiastical dignitaries were his father's guests, and in the chapter which follows on a Norman family, we shall see how they intermarried, Saxon and Norman, noble and burgher. Fitzstephen's account, though most interesting, leaves out a great many things which we should like to know. He brings before our eyes a city cheerful and busy, the young people delighting in games of all kinds, especially archery, wrestling, mock fights, skating. He shows us a place of great plenty and containing within its walls as much freedom and as much happiness as any medieval city could expect. He shows us the craftsmen living each in his own quarters. He shows us the monastic houses and the schools of children. He shows us a town in which all went well so long, he says, with significance, as there was a good king. Now the Norman kings were not without their faults, but one thing must be allowed them. They were strong kings, and at this time 339 and for many centuries to come, London wanted above all things a strong king, and if you look back at history, you will find that a strong king meant a just king. In fact, though we are as yet far off from an ideal London, Fitzstephen makes us understand that the people already possessed in Norman London an amount of liberty which was greater than that enjoyed by any city of France or Spain, and equal probably to that enjoyed by the people of Ghent and Bruges. A family group. Claude Mies before, 11th cent. London has always been a city of great plenty. As yet the stretches of foreshore and marsh all down the river were uninhabited, as most of them remain to the present day. All these marshes abounded with birds innumerable. The river was full of fish of all kinds. The supplies of cattle and of sheep and swine came from the meadows belonging to Westminster Abbey, and from the farms of Middlesex. The forest of Middlesex, which began at Islington, stretched north over an extensive tract. The forest of Essex was a continuation to the east, covering what were afterwards Epping and Hainault forests. The villages of Essex and Middlesex were clearings in the forest. I suppose that the people bred horses, cattle, sheep and pigs for the London markets. If the north part of London, where the craftsmen worked, was picturesque with the cottages among the trees, the south part was also picturesque, for the houses of the merchants were there, each with its hall and its garden. Churches stood everywhere. Most of them were quite small, plain village churches. Here and there a Saxon church, like that at Bradford on Avon, narrow and dark, no glass in the windows, no pavement on the floor. And down the narrow lanes we could watch the river with the ships going up and down, the yo-heave-ho of the outward bound, and the hymn to the Virgin for safety 340 on the voyage from those who worked their way up with the flood tide to deep anchor below the bridge. As for the people of the city, I venture to quote my own words from another book, London, p. 68. It is an evening in May. What means this procession? Here comes a sturdy rogue marching along valiantly, blowing pipe and beating tabor. After him, a rabble-rout of lads and young men, wearing flowers in their caps and bearing branches and singing lustily. The workman jumps up and shouts as they go past. The priest and the friar laugh and shout. The girls, gathering together as is the maiden's way, laugh and clap their hands. The young men sing as they go and dance as they sing. Spring has come back again. Sing cuckoo. The days of light and warmth. Sing cuckoo. The time of feasting and of love. Sing cuckoo. The proud abbot with his following draws rein to let them pass, and laughs to see them. He is, you see, a man first and a monk afterwards. In the gateway of his great house stands the Norman Earl with his livery. He waits to let the London youth go by. The Earl scorns the English youth no longer. He knows their lustihood. He can even understand their speech. He sends out largesse to the lads to be spent in the good wines of Gascony and of Spain. He joins in the singing. He waves his hand, a brotherly hand, as the floral greenery passes along. He sings with them at the top of his voice. Sing cuckoo, cuckoo, new sing cuckoo. Sing cuckoo, new. Presently the evening falls. It is light till past 8, the days are long. At nightfall in summer the people go to bed. In the great houses they assemble in the hall. In winter they would listen to music and the telling of stories, even the legends of King Arthur. Walter Map or Maps will collect them and arrange them, and the French romances such as Amies et Amels, Aucassin et Nicolette, though these have not yet been written down. In summer they have music before they go to bed. We are in a city that has always been fond of music. The noise of crowd and pipe, tabor and cithern is now silent in the streets. Rich men kept their own musicians. What said Bishop Grosseteste? Next high's chamber beside high's study. High's harper's chamber was fast the by. Many times by nights and days he had solace of notes and lays. One asked him the reason why he had delight in minstrelsy. He answered him on thise manner, why he held the harp so dear, the virtue of the harp thar skill and right, will destry the fendy's mit, and to the crows by goad scale, why's the harp likened whale, lady saving a stag from the hunters. Harl Ms 4751, 13th cent. He who looks and listens for the voice of the people in these ancient times hears no more than a confused murmur. One sees a swarm working like ants. A bell rings, they knock off work. Another bell, they run together, they shout, they wave their hats. The listener, however, hears no words. It is difficult in any age, even in the present day, to learn or understand what the bar's pupil think and what they desire. They want few things indeed in every generation, only, as I said above, the three elements of freedom, health, and just pay. Give them these three and they will grumble no longer. When a poet puts one of them on his stage and makes him act and makes him speak, we learn the multitude from the type. Later on, after Chaucer and Piers Plowman have spoken, we know the people better. As yet we guess at them, we do not even know them in part. Observe, however, one thing about London, a thing of great significance. When there is a jacquerie, when the people who have hitherto been as silent as the patient ox rise with a wild roar of rage, it is not in London. Here men have learned, however imperfectly, the lesson that only by combination of all for the general welfare is the common weal advanced. I think also that London men 342, even those on the lowest level, have always known very well that their humility of place is due to their own lack of purpose and self-restraint. The air of London had always been charged with the traditions and histories of those who have raised themselves. There never has been a city more generous to her children, more ready to hold out a helping hand. This we shall see illustrated later on. At present all is beginning. The elementary three conditions are felt, but not yet put into words. We are at present in the boyhood of a city, which after 1,000 years is still in its strong and vigorous manhood, showing no sign, not the least sign, of senility or decay. Rather does it appear like a city in its first spring of eager youth, but the real work for Saxon and Norman London lies before. It is to come. It is a work which is to be the making of Great Britain and of America, Australia and the Isles. It is the work of building up, defending, and consolidating the liberties of the Anglo-Saxon race. The question of slavery, whether it was common in London, and how long it lasted, is very difficult. When William told his new subjects that they were law-worthy, he meant that the freemen were law-worthy. None but freemen had any privileges at all. No one was allowed to have the freedom of the city unless he was known to be of free condition. And even if, after he had received the freedom, it became known that he was a person of servile condition, through that same fact he lost the freedom of the city. Liber Albus p. 30. Witness the case of Thomas le Bedel, Robert le Bedel, Alan Underwood and Edmund May, who in the year 1301 lost their freedom because it was discovered that they held land in villenage of the Bishop of London. The serfs or villeins held their land in villenage or in domain. They had no rights, and were the absolute property of their lords, who could dispossess them at any moment. Of the lower or dependent class there were many subdivisions. All these were more or less serfs, holding their lands by the tenure of certain services. In the whole of England, according to Domesday Book, there were about 225,000 of these people, so that, if each of them had a wife and 4 children, there were 1,250,000 of cultivators of the soil who were also serfs. There is evidence in plenty that the condition of these people under the Normans rapidly improved. The Norman knight could not understand all the distinctions. He lumped the people all together, and treated freemen and villani in much the same manner. Some of the villeins grew rich, some were emancipated formally, some passed through no form of emancipation. There remained, however, certain disabilities. They were not admitted to the freedom of the City of London, and we hear of complaints made about their admission to holy orders. If we try to apply these facts to London, we are baffled by a difficulty already indicated. Were there serfs in the city? If so, how many? What work did they undertake? Remember a point already advanced, that in a city of many 343 industries, if any industry or craft becomes regarded as especially the work of a slave, no freeman will ever after touch it. And if the slave is emancipated, he will never again do any of that work. But in London, there has never been any prejudice against any kind of work. I cannot understand how London at such a time could have been composed entirely of freemen, but of the slaves, if there were slaves, I can find no trace, no memory, and no indication. Saxon doorway, temple, church. There is, however, the ancient Saxon custom that obtains in all free boroughs, if a villein fled from his master and found shelter within the walls for a year and a day unclaimed, he thereby became free. Now it is true that mere residence is not enough. A man must remain all that time unclaimed. May we not see in this law the determination that within the walls of London there should be no slave at all? In the Liber Albus all that I can find on the subject is that persons holding land in villenage shall not be allowed the freedom of the city. This fact seems rather to point in the direction of allowing none but freemen in the city. In 1288 the attorney of the Earl of Cornwall preferred a claim in the hustings against 9 men, the bondmen of the Earl, runaways. The decision of the court is not given, but it is clear that the men who were villagers hoped to remain unclaimed in London, and that they were disappointed. On the whole, therefore, I am of opinion that London would not allow any but freemen to live and work within her walls. And we may remember the clause, number 24, in the ordinances of the Council of 1103, to the effect that there shall be no more buying and selling of men, which was hitherto accustomed. We have already seen what were the exports of London under the Saxons and Danes. Of course they remained the same under the Normans. Wool 344 was the staple. England subsisted, so to speak, upon her wool. It went to Bruges, to Germany, and to Italy. The imports were, as before, wine from Germany and La Rochelle, spices, gums, cloth of gold, silk, and the finer weapons. New communications were opened up with the continent, and England lost her ancient isolation when her people could freely cross into Normandy, where their king was duke. Trade was carried on by means of the tally. This was a piece of wood, generally willow wood, about 9 inches long, cut into notches. Thus, a notch 1.5 inches across at the widest or the outside part means 1,000 pounds, an inch across 100 pounds, half an inch 20 pounds, and a long, narrow, sloping notch 10 pounds. Other convenient marks denoted single pounds, shillings, and pence. The Great Fire of 1135 destroyed the whole of London from the bridge to the Fleet River. It is sometimes said that this fire destroyed everything that was Saxon. Perhaps it did, but things moved very slowly in the 11th century. We need not believe that there was any change at all in the buildings that succeeded Saxon London. The huts of the craftsmen, once burned down, were rebuilt on exactly the same plan. The frame houses of the merchant were rebuilt exactly as they had been before. What we may regret with the little Saxon churches, would that we had 1 or 2 of those left to us, and in addition, everything still remaining of Roman London. We shall never know what remains of Roman villas, temples, basilicas, baths, perished in this and other medieval fires, of which there were so many. It must have been mortifying to the English merchant that the whole of the foreign trade, the export and import trade, was carried on by strangers. The port of London for a long time had no ships, or next to none, of her own. The Flemings and the German ships came and went in fleets too strong to be attacked. Otherwise the narrow seas were swarming with pirates. There were English pirates, Norman pirates, and French pirates. None of them were anxious to respect a ship of their own nationality. It seemed as if by merely living in a seaport one became naturally a pirate. Our sailors were simply undisciplined pirates. When Henry I raised a fleet, the men mutinied and half of them went over to the enemy. The only chance of the London merchants was to send out a fleet strong enough to fight and beat off these pirates. This, however, they could not do. Therefore, for many a year to come the foreign trade of London remained with the men of Hamburg, Cologne, and Bruges. On the government of London at this period, we have spoken fully in the 2nd volume on medieval London, where will be found a chapter called The Commune, p. 11. Chapter 10. A Norman Family. In Appendix K to Geoffrey de Mandeville, Mr. J. H. Round presents a little group belonging to this period of 3 families, together with a collection of facts and figures which, despite their scantiness, enable us to obtain more than a glimpse of the London baron, the owner of manors and soches within and without the city, the merchant and the banker, the servant and the officer of the king, the Saxon who was also the companion and equal of the Norman nobles. Few discoveries, says Mr. Round, in the course of these researches have afforded me more satisfaction and pleasure than the investigation into the origin of Gervase de Cornhill, which led to the recovery of this group of the Norman period. It is difficult to imagine greater satisfaction for one who burrows among the documents of the past than thus to chance upon a chain of facts, which bring to light a whole family, with its history, at the time when the Normans and the English were beginning to intermarry, shortly before the time when it was said, Jam cohabitantibus Anglicis et Normannis, et alterutra muxors ducentibus vel nubentibus, sic permixti sunt nations, Ut vix discerni passit hodi, de liberis laqua, quis Anglicus, quis Normana sit gener. The most important of these families is that descended from one Herlwin, who, since his son was sheriff in 1130, when he was certainly not a very young man, was probably born before the conquest. Since his name is simply stated without the Norman addition showing his parentage, we may gather that the Saxons after the conquest retained the usage of giving the name without such qualification. Concerning Herlwin, Mr. Round tells us nothing except that he had at least 3 sons and 1 daughter. One of the sons, Ralph Fitz Herlwin, was sheriff in 1130. The daughter Ingenalda married Roger, nephew of Hubert. Ralph Fitz Herlwin's son Robert married Mary, niece of Nicholas, priest of St. Michael Cheap. Nicholas himself was the son of Algar, priest of the same church. This priest Algar held the living on lease from St. Paul's. His son succeeded him, and presented in his turn the living to his nephew by marriage, Robert Fitzralph, the grandson of Herlwin. We see therefore that priests married openly and blamelessly, and that they were able in some cases, as when they held a benefice, to bequeath, or to 346 transfer it to their heirs. Probably Nicholas had no sons, or Robert Fitzralph would have had to look elsewhere for a living. It is also apparent that the parish priests were recruited from the governing class of the city, and that this class intermarried with the children of the clergy. Roger, nephew to Hubert, was evidently a man of great consideration. He was chosen by the king in 1125 with Aubrey de Vere to invest the house of the Holy Trinity with the Portsoken, when the Senechan Guild handed it over to the monks. He was sheriff in the same year. He is mentioned in an earlier document as one of the barons of London, Hugoni de Barcheland Rogero Liefstano Ordgaro, et omnibus aliis baronibus Londonii. Mr. Round has found 2 royal charters, one of which conveys to him the manor of Chalk. Roger was one of the multitude who were affected by the great religious enthusiasm of the time. He must needs go on pilgrimage, and went to Jerusalem, dying on the way there or back, if he did not die in the holy city itself. It will be remembered that another city magnate, Gilbert Becket, also went on pilgrimage to Jerusalem at the same time. The son Gervase was called de Cornhill, as the heir of his wife's father, Edward de Cornhill or Hupcornhill. Mr. Round notes on the form Hupcornhill, similar forms at Colchester, as Oapthual and Hopoverhumber, i.e. the man who came up from beyond the Humber. He was sheriff in 1155, and is mentioned as justiciar of London in the only charter left of those granted by Stephen's queen, Siedes quad dedi Gervasio Justitianes de Londonia ex Marsetas terri. This Gervase of Cornhill or Gervase Fitzroger was one of the most prominent of the London citizens during the reigns of Stephen and Henry Roman II. He was born about the year 1110, and he died about the year 1183. He was a landowner in the city and in the country. The manor of Chalk, which had been granted to his father Roger, was afterwards granted to him in the records of the Duchy of Lancaster, 1123-1136, is a grant of land in Edentoun by William Archbishop of Canterbury to Gervase and Agnes his wife. Agnes is described as the daughter of Edward of Cornhill and Godlev his wife. The name of Gervase occurs twice under Stephen and innumerable times, Round under Henry Roman II, both in a public and a private capacity. Gervase was not only a merchant. Like all successful merchants of the time, he advanced money on mortgage and obtained lands by foreclosing. The strange history of the Senechan Guild and its dissolution has already been told. The light of reality is thrown upon this event when we read that Edward of Cornhill was one of the guild, that Edward of Southwark, the father of Godlev, and William of Southwark, her brother, were witnesses of the deed conveying Portsoken to the Holy Trinity Priory, as well as Roger, Gervase's father. Turn again to Gervase of Cornhill. His son Henry, Sheriff of London, Kent and Surrey, married Alice, a daughter and heiress of the English branch of the de 347 Curses. She afterwards married Warren Fitzgerald, the daughter of Henry and Alice, Joan de Cornhill, married Hugh de Neville, Forester of England. I think that nothing so far discovered better illustrates the position of the London merchants than this genealogy and these facts, rescued by a laborious antiquary from the scanty records of the time. We see the barons of London on an equality with the Norman aristocracy, acting with them and intermarrying with them, acquiring lands in the country, going on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, becoming the principal actors in that most remarkable event, the dissolution of the venerable Saxon Guild and the transfer of the property which they held in trust to a religious house. We see a merchant of London holding the post of justiciar. I wish it had been possible for Mr. Round to have carried his researches further into the annals of this family. One knows not where their descendants might be found at the present day. One more episode in the history of Gervase has been unearthed by Mr. Round, Feudal England, p. 471. The manor of Langham in Essex near Colchester was part of the property of the great Clare family. It was given by Richard de Clare, some time before the year 1086, to Walter Tyrrell, who married his daughter Adeliza. Sometime between 1138 and 1148, Hugh Tyrrell sold the manor or raised money upon it, the purchaser or the lender being Gervase of Cornhill, who obtained possession of it either by foreclosing the mortgage or by purchase, Hugh Tyrrell himself taking a part in the crusade, while the London merchant, staying at home, profited by the religious enthusiasm of the time. 50 years later, Richard I granted permission to Henry, son of Gervase of Cornhill, to enclose and empark his woods at Langham. Thus, says Round, did the wealthy Londoner become a country squire some centuries ago. See Appendix V. Genealogical tree. A tabular representation of the tree is shown here. Appendices. Appendix I. The river embankment. Let us add to this account that of the discoveries made in the parish of St. Michael Crooked Lane, in connection with the approaches of the new London Bridge. On cutting through the present embankment of the river, it appeared, as might be expected, to be of comparatively modern construction. The outward wall was upright, and of Kentish rag, in courses of about 14 inches, and about 1 foot in the bed. It was backed by quantities of chalk and great lumps of madrepore, the latter supposed, from being of foreign produce, to have been brought hither by ships as ballast, and thrown against the wall as rubbish to fill up the vacant spaces. Proceeding northwards, the ground was found to be a mass of marsh, extending from the river's edge to about 60 feet beyond Thames Street. Evidently from its having once formed part of the bed of the river, it shelved up towards Thames Street, and was dug into from 10 to 24 feet deep at that part, to find a safe foundation for laying the south abutment of the land arch built across Thames Street. But the soil proved to be so loose that vast quantities of solid materials were obliged to be sunk for making a secure foundation. This was also the case in laying the foundations of the walls of all the brick arches which support the northern approach, though in no place was the soil found of so marshy a nature as here. The site of the ancient oyster gate was identified by cartloads of oyster shells being found on the spot. This place had been hid in the reign of Elizabeth, by building what Stowe calls the artificial forcier or engine for increasing the supply of Thames water to the metropolis, and which was succeeded by the later waterworks. In digging at the greatest depth on this site, there was turned up part of a leathern sandal, singularly looped on the sides, which had been apparently lost in the mud. Also some fragments of Roman pottery and a few coins. The principal discovery here, and beyond it northwards, however, was of 2 separate ancient lines of embankment, one being on the south side of Thames Street, and the other at some distance. The first embankment on the south side of Thames Street was found about 10 feet below the surface of the street, and was traced to the depth of more than 20 feet. It was formed of large solid trees of oak and chestnut, about 2 feet square, roughly hewn, having camp sheathings and strong timber wattlings spiked to the piles, the whole of great strength and massiveness. St. Michael Crooked Lane, pp. 1314. The original embankment lower down the river at Dagenham was 352, composed of large trunks of trees, similar to what were discovered on the above occasion in Thames Street, only that yew trees were used instead of oaks. On digging down about 22 feet at a place called the Moorlog, a marsh which must have aboriginally resembled Southwark, they met with a vein of divers sorts of rotten wood, yew timber only, which was found amongst it, being not decayed, which lay about 3.5 or 4 feet underneath the surface of the marsh ground belonging to the levels, about 10 feet in depth, and with very little mixture of earth that could be discerned amongst it. Underneath it there was about 12 or 15 inches depth of blue clay, then gravel and sand. A great part of this moorlog seemed to be comprised of small brushwood, and many hazelnuts had been taken up in digging, which the captain had in his hand, and looked to have been firm, but upon a very little pressure they broke to dust. Several of the yew trees found were 14 or 16 inches diameter, and perfectly sound excepting the sap. The willow or sallow trees were, many of them, found of 2 feet and upwards diameter and retained a whitish colour like touchwood. Above the vein mentioned they found, as in Thames Street, stag's horns. The same sort of marsh ground was found at Woolwich and Dipped Ford. St. Michael Crooked Lane, pp. 1516 note. In 1826, an excavation in Tooley Street brought to light a curious embankment. The first few feet were made ground, merely rubbish. Then came a thick, close, sedimentary deposit of alluvial clay and Thames River mud, averaging about 7 to 10 feet thick, which evidently had its origin in the tidal and sedimentary matter from the adjacent river. Below this mud and clay deposit was a close stratum of peat, tightly compressed, varying materially in thickness in different places along the street, but averaging from 2 to 4 and 5 feet in thickness. This peat was chiefly composed of vestiges of hazel trees, hazelnuts in beautiful preservation, fragments of oak, beech, and other trees, and leaves and stems of various plants confusedly intermixed. The wood and hazelnuts and the oak differing in no respect in their character from what might be grown at the present time in the same neighborhood. This peat and wood had undergone no apparent chemical change. It was highly saturated with moisture, had rather an agreeable odor, and was of a light brown color. Fragments of the hazel and oak wood, on being kept in a dry situation for 2 or 3 months, shrunk into about 1/10 of their original size by the evaporation of the combined water, but left the outside bark in its original shape, while the remaining inside, ligneous fiber of the hazel or oak became, on cutting it with a knife, nearly as black and as hard as ebony. Below this stratum of peat came the usual angular fragments called by geologists diluvial gravel, consisting of fragments of flint reposing on the great argillaceous deposit of the blue London clay. St. Michael Crooked Lane, pp. 1617 note. Returning to St. Michael S., the second embankment was discovered about 60 feet beyond the north side of Thames Street, towards Crooked Lane, and was of a completely different character from the one just described. It was composed of strong elm piles from 8 to 10 feet long, closely driven together in the ground with a wailing piece or brace at the top. Ibid, pp. 1618. Appendix Roman II. The Riverside Discoveries. The following extracts from Archaeologia Vol. Roman III give fuller information on the results of excavation along the riverside. It is well known that, to arrive at the solid clay in Thames Street for the purpose of planting foundations, a considerable depth must be attained. It must be remembered that, apart from the accumulation of centuries since the Roman occupation, the levels of this neighborhood were greatly altered at the time of the Great Fire. The slope of the various hills leading from Cannon Street to the river was entirely changed, and in Thames Street the roadway was in many places raised from 3 to 7 feet. In watching, therefore, the sinking of the shafts which were to receive the piers of the railway arches, it was possible to trace the successive mementos of London's history from the last century back to the Roman period. There were the traders, tokens, bellarmines and other late pottery, medieval spurs, daggers, objects in leather, and lastly occurred the coins, styli, pins in bone and bronze, personal ornaments, etc., associated with quantities of the bright red Samian pottery. From 20 to 25 feet appeared to be the average depth of the Roman level, and here, driven into the clay along the whole extent of the excavations, were numerous piles and transverse beams extending right across the street, and forming a complete network of timber. Many of these beams measured as much as 18 inches square, and all were of great strength and durability. They doubtless formed the old waterline and Thames embankment, fronting the southern portion of Roman London. Such beams were observed on both sides of the street, and many had probably been supports for the Roman buildings, which so plentifully existed in the neighbourhood of Bush Lane and Scott's Yard. Towards Cannon Street were large masses of Roman masonry, such as have been described by Mr. Roach Smith in the 29th volume of the Archaeologia. Much of this had to be removed, and it was interesting to observe how completely the old walls defied the appliances of modern engineering, the necessary dislodgement being only effected by the aid of gunpowder. In some cases, I believe, the veritable Roman walls now form foundations for the support of the railway arches. In some places could be detected the junction of the clay and gravel with the soft black earth and refuse, betokening the old course of the Walbrook, which at Dowgate Dock flowed into the Thames. From the great quantity of antiquities, it has been suggested that this particular spot may have been an ancient rubbish chute, such as the celebrated pit at the Royal Exchange. The beautiful preservation of the coins and metal objects favours the idea that the whole had been formerly covered by the Thames. From the steelyard there is a very elegant bronze in low relief, respecting which various conjectures have been made. Mr. Smith pronounces it a figure of hope, and he refers to the coins of Claudius with a similar figure, inscribed spes avsta. It seems to have been affixed to a coffer or to some object as a decoration. It is now in the possession of Mr. Cecil Brent, to whom we owe so much for the interest he has so successfully taken in the antiquities of Roman London. Of coins may be selected large and middle brass of Claudius, Nero, Vespasian and Domitian, but their reverses are all well known. Pottery is well represented, large quantities of Samian having been found, including some fine examples, bearing incuse patterns which are extremely uncommon. There are also some good specimens of Upchurch pottery. One of the black vessels appears to have had a handle, and is of an unusual type. In glass there are pieces known as pillar moulding, which are very rare in London, though in some parts of England perfect vessels of this kind have at times been found, and are duly recorded in Mr. Roach Smith's Carlectania Antiqua, as well as in his Roman London. Pins, needles, knives and spoons have been found in large numbers both in bone and bronze. Among the spoons is a perfect example of the long-stemmed spoon, with a narrow bowl at one end and an oblong termination at the other. Such are figured by Mr. Roach Smith, who considers them to have been employed in extracting unguents, etc., from the small long-necked bottles familiarly known as lacrimatories. 2 of similar form were, he says, discovered in a metal case with a box of colours, and a variety of implements and glass bottles, in the grave of a female painter near Fontenay. And as the whole of the minor objects clearly appertained to the profession of the defunct, these spoons were doubtless used for extracting liquids from the bottles for mixing and preparing colours, in which process the oblong ends were probably of service. We have also some good Roman keys, a few fibble, the beam of a pair of scales, and among the minor relics a little fish hook, a plentiful supply too of Roman leather. Some of the sandals are beautifully preserved, and indicate the moisture of the soil in which they were embedded. Most of these, as is usual, are of small and medium size, having doubtless belonged to females and young people. But there are those that have evidently belonged to the other sex. The round-topped nails with which the soles are so densely studded are, with other appearances of strength, evidences that they once belonged to feet accustomed to a firm and heavy tread. The numerous piles and transverse beams which extended across Thames Street were traced for a considerable distance along the river bank, and in an upward direction towards Cannon Street. So complete a network of timber did they form, and so massive and durable were the means employed for holding the entire fabric together, that it is evident it was intended to resist a heavy strain or pressure. The Walbrook here flowed into the Thames, and the drainage of the old city being on a different scale to what it now is, it is probable that the soil of the locality would be damp and yielding, and that some protection for the foundations of the buildings reared along the water line would be necessary against the inroads of the river. Above this embankment buildings of great magnitude must have existed, if we may judge from the strength and solidity of these foundations. Mr. Thomas D. E. Gunston, who paid great attention to the excavations at the time, took copious notes, from which he has courteously permitted me to condense the more important particulars. Running nearly in a line with Bush Lane was an immense external wall, some 200 feet long, 10 feet high, and 12 feet in thickness, formed of ragstone, chalk, and a variety of materials bound together with mortar in the ordinary Roman fashion. At an angle were foundations 8 feet wide, of flint and rubble supporting smaller walls, some 3 feet wide, composed principally of banding tiles 18 inches by 12. These were connected by a series of cross walls 2 feet 6 inches thick, and built of flat tiles 14 inches by 11, also set on rubble footings 4 feet in width. Still nearer Cannon Street were the remains of an apartment 50 feet by 40, floored with a coarse red concrete. This was connected with a second, which had access to a third but smaller room. A long series of smaller apartments were satisfactorily traced, with floors of coarse tesser of red and yellow brick in cubes about an inch square. Some little distance in front of the centre apartment in this series was a square piece of paving comprised of oblong bricks on edge, known as herringbone pavement. Adjoining a thick rubble wall was a large portion of a mosaic pavement, comprised of half-inch cubes of black, white, red and grey tesser, worked into a simple pattern and surrounded by a double border of black and grey stones of a compact nature, and from 4 to 6 inches square, but varying in thickness. In close proximity to this human remains were found. There were evidences of strong timber drains or waterways, 5 feet beneath the foundations of the building, and having a steep incline to the river. This measured 4 feet across, and was 18 inches deep, the boards forming the sides being 4 inches and those at the bottom 6 inches in thickness. The other channels were of smaller dimensions. Within several of the room's wall paintings remained, the designs in various colours, some divided by lines and bands into panels, others ornamented by a trellis pattern or powdering of fancy-coloured spots, besides a quantity of roofing, hypocaust and building tiles, fragments of pottery, glass and articles of personal and domestic use. On many of the tiles were the letters PPBR, LAN, such as have been observed before to be worthy of notice, as recording the fact of their having been made by the first cohort of the Britons stationed at Londinium. Others were scored with geometrical figures or small squares worked with a diamond pattern. Appendix Roman 3. Stripe on Roman remains. In the appendix to his edition of Stowe, 1720, Stripe devotes a short chapter to the antiquities found in London, which I have thought of sufficient importance to be transcribed in full. There are preserved, either in public repositories or in more private custody, many antique curiosities, found chiefly in digging foundations for the building of London after the Great Fire, and occasionally at other times. In the repository of the Royal Society in Gresham College, there is a large glass urn that holds about a gallon, and hath a few shivers of bones in it. It was taken up since the fire in Spitalfields. The glass is somewhat thick, bellying out, and contracting towards the mouth with a lip. But the collections made by Dr. John Woodward, Professor of Physic in Gresham College, is by much the most considerable of any, for besides an ancient marble bust of Jupiter, a marble head with a Phrygian tiara, a Grecian bas-relievo, a votive shield, exhibiting the sacking of Rome by the Gauls, the embossment of which is allowed by the greatest judges to be the finest and most exquisite that all antiquity hath left us. Several iconculi of the deities, both Egyptian and Roman, considerable variety of amulets, periapta, phalli, bull scarabi, gems with historical sculpture, heads, etc. graven upon them, camei and intaglias of Egyptian, Grecian and Roman work, many Roman, Greek, Syrian and other medals, Roman weights, a Roman semicongius, urns, lacrimatories and other things, procured from Alexandria, Constantinople, Rome, etc., and besides, an ancient Roman altar from the Picts' wall in Northumberland, with a considerable inscription upon it. Several ancient weapons of brass, thuribula, pater, urns, etc., found in the remoter parts of this kingdom, Cumberland, the Isle of Man, Yorkshire, Wiltshire, Gloucestershire, Northamptonshire, Devonshire, etc. He hath a vast variety of ancient instruments, utensils, vasa, and the like, that have been discovered in several places in and about this city. In particular, several vessels of religious use, and employed in the sacrifices, as for example, piarfericula, simpula, pater, thuribula, labra, digged up, together with horns, teeth, and other parts of the beasts that were offered sacrifice, above 20 sepulchral urns of various forms and sizes, likewise lanxes, ampher, craters, siphi, gutti, parcula, al numeri claus, parts of the plasmata fictilia in which the embossed vasa were moulded, and lamps of various sorts. The precedent vessels are of pot or earth, several of them extremely fine, well baked, some curiously glazed, and the colours very beautiful. As to their forms, they are universally very elegant and handsome. And indeed the doctor, the possessor of them, well observeth, that the remains of these works of the Romans show them to have been a people of an exact genius, good fancy, and curious contrivance. 'Tis observable also in this collection, that the things are fair, well preserved, and entire, which, considering the great number and diversity of them, how brittle parts and glasses are, and how liable to be defaced, injured, and dashed in pieces, is the more extraordinary. He hath likewise in his cabinet of antiquities a glass urn with a cover, also a siphus, divers ample, phial, and lacrimatories of glass, that are very fair and perfect. Then there are several pieces of British money, coined both before and after the descent of the Romans upon this island, as also Roman numismata coined here. Besides Saxon, Danish, and Norman coins, which as well 357 as others are very fair and happily preserved. Likewise styles of ivory, bone, and steel, several fibble, aciculi, bull, claves, armili, annuli, beads of various sorts, ale, tessar, pectines, calcarea, spicula, jacula, likewise tiles, pieces of lithostrata, or tessellated pavements of earth, glass, paste, enamel, and gilded. So that Dr. Woodward's museum is a treasury of all sorts of commodities and utensils, sacred and profane, of ancient heathen Rome, as vessels for sacrifice, and for other subordinate uses in sacris. Vessels also for uses domestic, sepulchral, military, personal, for wearing and dressing, also divers pieces of art relating to building, or sculpture, explanatory of some parts of Roman history. Besides these remains of Roman skill and workmanship, here are also reposited several Gothic historical carvings, in copper, ivory, and wood, the work of some of them very good, impresses on lead and leaden seals, that have been affixed anciently to popes' bulls, with various other things, all well chosen of real importance, and serviceable to some useful design. One great intention of this learned gentleman, as he hath assured me, in amassing together so great a number of these things, and that with so great diligence, trouble, and expense, was in order to clear and give light to those ancient writers who mention and treat of them, viz., the Greeks and Romans, which he hath read and studied with great exactness. Another of his ends herein was, to illustrate the history and antiquities of this great and noble city, out of the ruins of which these things were retrieved, upon the occasion of that great digging, greater indeed than ever happened from the foundation of it before, and the removal of rubbish that was made in all parts after the late great fire, and indeed the medals and coins, the various figures, historical embossments and inscriptions upon the vases, contribute very much to that end, and farther from the various places in which the urns were found reposited, which, according to the laws of the 12 tables, were to be buried without the walls, he is able to ascertain the ancient bounds of this city, whilst Roman, from several things discovered in laying the foundation of St. Paul's Church, to show, not only that there was anciently a temple there, but also, by some instances to prove that it was dedicated to Diana, according to the ancient tradition, notwithstanding that a very learned antiquary as well as divine has lately offered to the contrary. Indeed, the far greater part of these things is so very considerable, that it would afford much satisfaction to inquisitive people to see icons graved of them, and that the possessor could have spared so much time from his business and his other studies as to have writ his own observations and reflections upon them, that I might have entered them, as I requested of him, in this work. In Black Friars, in clearing away the rubbish, in order to building after the great fire, they came to a thick wall, very probably a part of the foundation wall of the old friary, in which wall was placed somewhat like a cupboard shut, which being opened, in it were found 4 dead men's heads, reposited in fine pewter cases made for them, round only flat on one side, and a thick cover of pewter, having a ring fastened on the top, for the more convenient taking it off or putting it on. 3 of these heads are now lost, likely enough conveyed beyond sea where they may serve for relics. That which remained is or was lately in the possession of Mr. Prestbury, a soap maker in East Smithfield, who showed it me Oct. 2, 1703. We took out the head from the case. It had been wrapped in black silk, which was then grown rotten. The skin was like a piece of tanned leather or bacon, the hair of the temples yellow, but upon the head the hair was red, short and thick, and would not be pulled off. There was a tonsure or round bare place on the crown of the head that bespake him to have been in holy orders, the nose flat as though a piece of it had been cut off, the mouth gaping, the teeth in the head found 10 in number, the rest had been pulled out. The features still discoverable, there remained a great deal of dust of a brownish colour in the case. On the side of the cover was scratched this name in a bad character, I Cornelius. There was one corpse found near it underground without a head. These seem to have been friars of this religious house, or some of their benefactors, or their saints or martyrs, whose heads perhaps were taken out and shewn upon extraordinary days and occasions, and upon the dissolution of the house, it may be here concealed. Near the foundation of Charing Cross at a great depth were stones found, which seemed to be a sort of coarse marble, of a blackish colour, and cut into several plain sides, but irregular. From whence, saith Dr. Crewe, they may be argued to be very ancient. These were given by Sir Joseph Williamson to the museum in Gresham College. In Mark Lane a strange brick was found 40 years before, or better, about 28 foot deep in the ground, by Mr. Stockley, while he was digging a foundation and cellars for an house which he built for Mr. Woolley. On this brick was formed Samson, as I had it from J. Bagford, with the jawbone of an ass in his right hand, and his left hand lifted up, with 2 foxes before him, running together with firebrands at their tails, scaring them into high-standing corn hard by. This, methinks, might have belonged to the house of some Jew dwelling thereabouts, signifying his malice to some neighbouring Christian merchant that dealt in corn. For 'tis remarkable that near this place where this brick was found was also digged up burnt wheat, to the quantity of many quarters, very black but yet sound. Probably it was some granary consumed by fire. But take what the said Mr. Bagford hath since writ in his letter to Mr. Hearn of Oxford, that this brick was of a Roman make, of a curious red clay, and in bas relief, and was a key brick to the arch, and the burnt wheat was conjectured to have lain buried ever since the burning of the city 800 years before, and that it is preserved in the museum belonging to the Royal Society in Fleet Street, and that Mr. Waller's conjecture of it was that it had been made and set there by some Jew settling here in the arch of his own granary. A piece of mosaic work found deep underground in Holborn, near St. Andrew's Church, inlaid with black, white and red stones in squares and other regular figures, in the above-said museum. In digging for the foundations of St. Paul's Cathedral at the West End since the fire, was found variety of Roman sacrificing vessels, whereof a great quantity of the fragments were digged up. They were made of a curious red earth. The glazing of them still remains, which is curious. They are of divers shapes and sizes, as occasion should require them to be made use of in their sacrifices, and in many the potter's name was stamped at the bottom. Some of these Mr. Bagford, a citizen of London, studious of antiquities and especially of such as relate to the said city, took up with his own hands. Farther on the south side of the said West End was found a potter's kiln, the shape of which was circular. In this the above said sacrificing vessels probably were made. It was near to the temple where Diana was worshipped, for the more convenience of the people that came thither to sacrifice, that they might be furnished with all sorts of vessels they had occasion for, at the time when they made their sacrifices, and likewise thereabouts were found several moulds of earth, some exhibiting figures of men, of lions, of leaves of trees, and other things. These were used to make impression of those things upon the vessels. These moulds are also among the forementioned curious collections of Dr. Woodward. The representation of the aforesaid pottery, drawn with a pen, is in the possession of Sir Hans Sloane, Bart., M.D., of the Royal Society, with a description of it added. Also at the south side of St. Paul's Church, at the beginning to build it after the fire, were found several scalps of oxen, and a large quantity of boars' tusks, with divers earthen vessels, especially pater of different shapes. In Canning Street, nigh Bush Lane, was found pretty deep in the earth, a large pavement of Roman mosaic work. Dr. Hook gave a piece of it to the repository in Gresham College. In Goodman's Fields without Aldgate was a Roman burying place, for since the buildings there about 1678 have been found there in digging for foundations, vast quantities of urns and other Roman utensils as knives, combs, etc., which are likewise in the possession of Dr. Woodward. Some of these urns had ashes of bones of the Dean in them, and brass and silver money, and an unusual urn of copper, curiously enamelled in colours red, blue, and yellow. In Kent Street, all along the gardens on the right-hand side of the road going out of town, have been digged up several Roman vessels, as urns, ample, and other things, and among the rest an head of Janus cut in stone, that is still preserved, being placed over the door at the entry of one of those gardeners' houses. Money was offered for this Janus head, but it would not be taken, being 359 kept superstitiously, as though it were found by revelation in a dream. A woman, about the time it was found, dreaming she was brought to bed of a child with two faces. At Peckham was a very large urn of glass digged up in the highway, which is now in Gresham College. For these last accounts I am beholden to my friend, the above said Mr. Bagford, late deceased in the Charter House, having been a brother there. In April in the year 1707, divers Roman antiquities were found in digging by the wall near Bishopsgate within. Mr. Joseph Miller, an apothecary, living very near the place, while the labourers were digging for foundations and cellars for some new houses to be built in Camomile Street, did first discover several of these antiquities, which he communicated to Dr. John Woodward of Gresham College aforesaid, who, according to his wonted exactness, gave this narration of them in a letter to Sir Christopher Wren, which he courteously let me peruse. About 4 foot underground was discovered a pavement, consisting of diced bricks, the most red but some black and others yellow, each somewhat above an inch in thickness. The extent of the pavement in length was uncertain, it running from Bishopsgate for 60 foot, quite under the foundation of some houses not yet pulled down. Its breadth was about 10 foot, terminating on that side, at the distance of 3 foot and a half from the wall. Sinking downwards under the pavement, only rubbish occurred for about 2 foot, and then the workmen came to a stratum of clay in its natural state, in which at the depth of 3 foot more were found several urns. Some of them were become so tender and rotten that they easily crumbled and fell to pieces. As for those that had the fortune better to escape the injuries of time, and the strokes of the workmen, they were of different forms, but all of very handsome make and contrivance, as, indeed, most of the Roman vessels we find ever are, which is but one of the many instances that are at this day extant of the art of that people, of the great exactness of their genius, and happiness of their fancy. These urns were of various magnitudes, the largest capable of holding 3 full gallons, the least somewhat above a quart. All these had in them ashes and cinders of burnt bones. Along with the urns were found various other earthen vessels, as a simpulus, a patterer of a very fine red earth, and a bluish glass vial of that sort that is commonly called a lachrymatory. On this there appeared something like gilding, very fine. There were likewise found several beads, 1 or 2 copper rings, a fibula of the same metal but much impaired and decayed, as also a coin of Antoninus Pius, exhibiting on one side the head of that emperor with a radiated crown on, and this inscription Antoninus Aug. at about the same depth with the things before mentioned, but nearer to the city wall, and without the verge of the pavement, was digged up in human skull, with several bones that had not been burnt, as those in the urns had. But for a larger and more satisfactory account of these antiquities, I refer the reader to the said learned doctor's letter, now printed at large by Mr. Hearn, with Leland's itinerary in octavo. An elephant's body was found in a field near to Sir John Oldcastle's, not far from Battle Bridge, by Mr. John Kinnears, an apothecary, and a great searcher after antiquities as he was digging there. Some years ago, on the south side of Ludgate, was taken up out of the rubbish a Roman inscription, taken notice of by learned men. Coming in at Ludgate, in the residentiary's yard of St. Paul's, was discovered some years ago an aqueduct, close adjoining to the wall of the city, and such another was found after the fire by Mr. Span in Holiday Yard in Creed Lane, in digging the foundation for a new building. And this was carried round a bath, that was built in a Roman form, with niches at an equal distance for seats. Anno 1716, in digging for the foundation of a new church, to be erected where the church of St. Mary Woolnoth in Lombard Street stood at the depth of about 15 foot, and so lower to 22 foot were found Roman vessels, both for sacred and domestic uses of all sorts and in great abundance, but all broken. And with all were taken up tusks and bones of boars and goats, as also many medals and 360 pieces of metals, some tessellated works a piece of an aqueduct, and at the very bottom a well filled up with mire and dirt, which being taken away there arose a fine spring of water. Dr. Harwood of the Commons hath been very exact in taking notice from time to time of these antiquities, and hath sorted and preserved a great many of the most curious and remarkable of them, and supposeth by probable conjecture that here was not only a pottery, but also that on this place or near it stood the temple of Concord, which our Roman historians speak of to have been in this city, when called Trinobantum. These sherds were in such vast quantities that many cartloads were carried away with the rubbish, and the roads about St. George's Fields in Southwark mended with them. Anno 1718, in the month of May, the workmen pulling down a wall at Bridewell Hospital found a gold ring 1 inch and quarter broad, enamelled, having the resemblance of Christ on the cross engraved on it with a mourning heart, and a pillar with a cock on the top. The inscription was in Arabic, and some antiquaries who saw it reckoned it to be 1500 years since it was made. This is related in the Weekly Journal, number 1047. This is what I could, by diligent enquiry of my friends, collect concerning antiquities found in London. Strype Stowe Survey Vol. Roman 2, Appendix Roman 9, pp. 21-24. Appendix Roman 4. The Clapton Sarcophagus. Extract from a paper read before the Society of Antiquaries in 1867, C.L.&M. Archaeological Society, Vol. Roman 3. The site is levelled ground, recently meadowland and market gardens, situate at rear of the London Orphan Asylum, Clapton, on the brow of the hill, passing down to the marshes and River Lee, within a few feet of an old path just demolished which ran from Homerton to Lee Bridge, via Booksby's Walk, in the direction from south to north and another way, for many years past but a private road to a farm, running west to east, viz., from Clapton Square via Clapton Alley or passage to the Lee River. These paths intersect each other near the spot. They are very ancient and in all probability old Roman ways. The coffin was found on the natural gravel, 2 feet 6 inches from the surface, lying due east and west, the foot to the east. It is of white coarse-grained marble and is cut from a solid block. It is about 6 feet 3 inches long, 1 foot 3 inches wide, and 1 foot 6 inches deep, the thickness being about 212 inches. The inner surface is smooth, with a rise of half an inch at one end to serve as a rest for the head. No vestige of a lid or covering has been found, but at each end are evidences of clamp fastenings. It is plain on all sides but the front, which is ornamented with a fluted pattern, the channels being filled to a third of their height with a bead, and is an excellent illustration of cabled fluting. The medallion in the centre is deeply cut, about 12 inches in diameter, and encircles a well-executed bust, possibly a portrait of the deceased. This is much damaged, with the exception of the hair and the folds of the toga about the shoulders. These are as sharp and clear as if just cut. The right hand is supported by the thumb, apparently hooked within the folds across the breast, the 4 and middle fingers being stretched to their full length and in an upward direction. The 3rd and 4th fingers are doubled in. Beneath the medallion is an inscription in Roman letters, but unfortunately it has not yet been deciphered. This side of the coffin is finished off by 2 Corinthian pilasters, as shown in the illustration. I am informed that on clearing away the superincumbent debris, the coffin was found to contain a skeleton, in the position of ordinary Christian burial, with black mold about it. The skull soon fell to pieces and the bones were much decayed. Those remaining comprised portions of the head of a femur, right, middle third of left femur, portions of left tibia and fibula, and 2 pieces of ribs. I should judge the deceased to have been a small-boned man, about 6 feet high and rather knock-kneed, and take him to have been a civilian of rank, possibly a jurist but not a military man. Not far from the sarcophagus, a small brass coin of Gallienus was discovered. The only sarcophagus that has been found in London which bears any resemblance to that under consideration is the one from Haydon Square, Minories, and that only in the fact of its being ornamented on its front and side. The lid too, which is sharply ridged, is decorated with a foliated pattern. It is formed of ragstone, and more roughly made than that from Clapton. In the centre is a bust in bas-relief, and on either side a striated pattern, such as may be frequently observed on examples from abroad. At York, sarcophagi have been discovered with inscriptions upon them on plain labels, others have had objects in relief. At Avisford in Sussex, a fine example was exhumed containing glass, pottery, etc., which has been described in the Journal of the Sussex Archaeological Society and other antiquarian publications. In Gaul and Italy, marble sarcophagi are of course the rule. The material was at hand and easy of access. Consequently, the ruins of the Roman towns produce countless instances of ornamented marble tombs. Fig. 1, Plate 6 is in the Museum of Mr. Gunston, and was discovered in the vicinity of Old Ford, near Bow, associated with pottery. Another of the same character was found not long since in the same locality on some property belonging to Mr. Joseph Wilkinson. He has very kindly sent me all the particulars concerning it. He describes it as being excavated from some ground held by him for building purposes near the Saxon Road and Carbourne Road, Bow, some 60 yards south of the Roman highway. The coffin lay upon the gravel beneath some 30 inches of superincumbent soil. Its length is about 6 feet 6 inches, width 2 feet 2 inches less at the foot. The lid is slightly ridged. In it were contained the bones of a full-sized man in a good state of preservation. There was a fracture across the lid through which a quantity of gravel had fallen, covering as it were the skeleton, which appeared to have been buried, as the custom was, in lime. Its situation was east and west, and the arms of the skeleton were drawn down at the side, differing in this respect from that found some years since in the same locality, and described by Mr. B. H. Cowper in our journal. In the latter case the arms of the skeleton were crossed upon the breast, and the form of the coffin similar to that in Fig. 1. At a distance of some 2 feet south of the coffin, a large collection of pottery was discovered. In May last I received a letter from my friend Mr. H. W. King, Hun. Sec. Essex Archaeological Society, announcing that 2 more sarcophagi of a similar character had been found in the same locality, in the course of excavations for buildings on a site some 200 yards south of the former discoveries. Appendix V. With one of these Norman burghers the life of St. Thomas brings us in contact, and, scanty as are the details of the story, they agree in a very striking way with the indications afforded us by the Charter of the King. The story of the early years of Thomas Becket has very naturally been passed over with little attention by his modern biographers in their haste to fight the battle of his after-career. But long before he became St. Thomas, Archbishop Thomas or Thomas of Canterbury, he was known as Thomas of London, son, to use his own boast, of a citizen living without blame among his fellow citizens. So completely was the family adopted into the city that the monks of Canterbury could beg loans from the burgesses on the plea that the great martyr was a Londoner born, and on the city seal of the 14th century, London addressed him as at once her patron and her son. Me, qui te peperi, ni cesses Toma Turi. The name of his father, Gilbert Becket, is one of the few that remain to us of the Portreeves, the predecessors of the mayors under Stephen. He held a large property and houses within the walls, and a proof of his civic importance was long preserved in the annual visit of each newly elected chief magistrate to his tomb in the little chapel which he had founded in the churchyard of Pol. S. Yet Gilbert was one of the Norman strangers who followed in the wake of the Conqueror. He was by birth a burgher of Rouen, as his wife was of a burgher family of Caen. He claimed kinship with the Norman Theobald, and received the Norman Baron de l'Aigle as a guest. But the story of the Beckets does more than illustrate the outer position of the Norman colony. It gives us a glimpse, the more precious because it is unique, of its inner life. Students of hagiology learn to be cautious about the stories of precocious holiness, the apocryphal gospels of the infancy, which meet them at the outset of most saints' lives. But it is remarkable that in the life of St. Thomas there is no pretension of the kind. In the stead of juvenile miracles, we are presented with the vivid little picture of a London home, which sets the Norman colony fairly before us. We see the very aspect of the house, the mercer's chapel in Cheapside, still preserves its site for us, the tiny bedroom, the larger hall opening directly on the bustle of the narrow Cheap. We gain a hint from the costly coverlet of purple, sumptuously wrought, which Mother Rohes flings over her child's cradle, of the new luxury and taste which the conquest had introduced into the home of the trader as into the castle of the noble. A glance at the guests and relatives of the family shows how the new colony served as medium between the city and the court. The young Baron Richer of Aquila is often there, hunting and hawking with the boy, as he grows up. Archdeacon Baldwin and Clerk Eustace look in from Canterbury to chat over young Thomas and his chances of promotion in the Curia of Archbishop Theobald. There is a kinsman, too, of Gilbert S., a citizen of his own stamp, Osborne Hewitt Deniers, of great name and repute, not only among his fellow burghers but also with those of the court. Without the home, the Norman influence makes itself felt in a new refinement of manners and breeding. The young citizen grows up free and genial enough, but with a Norman horror of coarseness in his geniality. London shares in the great impulse which the conquest has given to education. The children of her citizens are sent to the new priory of Merton. The burghers flock to the boys' exercises at the schools attached to the three principal churches of the town. The chief care of Rohes was for her son's education. In his case it is finished at Paris, before the young Londoner passes to the merchant's desk. Historical Studies, J.R. Green.